And again, that's sort of based on, the culture of the society, right? Is wearing a pink shirt feminine or masculine, right? That hasn't always been defined as it currently is defined, right, in our culture, with these so-called gender reveal parties, which is really interesting to think about that. They have them when they're young, and people across a broad swath think, oh, that's okay. But if somebody, say, was 17 or 15 and has a gender reveal party because they've discovered that their gender is not what their parents had thought it was, that is not celebrated widely in our society. More so now, but still limited, I would say. And then there's gender identity, which is how you think about yourself. And again, all of these are on a spectrum, as indicated here, right? With woman, gender queer. Queer can be a word that refers to anything that is beyond what is considered cis. Right? Cis is when your identity, expression, biological sex, and does orientation count in there? For cis? No. Right. 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 So your expression, your identity, and your biological sex are all in the same place. Right, as opposed to gender queer or people who just identify as queer, where it means that somewhere, in there is a difference between how you were thought of as yourself, perhaps growing up, and how you end up expressing and thinking of yourself as an adult. Have I gotten most of it right? More or less, right? Yes, yeah. There are also another set of definitions that I included for your benefit at the back of this packet. I'm not going to go into all of those, but back of the packet. And then, right. And then on the back of the page are, as we said, mental health resources, not only because this was created for a mental health organization, but also because this is important information for all of us to be able to have and to know, because whether it's someone in our own family, somebody who we interact with in our work communities, patients, whoever it may be, right? Most of us will know somebody who either personally or has a family member who, as they're trying to figure this out, may be going through some real struggles emotionally, and otherwise. And so knowing these resources, being able to share these resources with others who may be in need of them, I think is very important for everybody to have. Okay, so as I said, the back of the packet has more definitions. Those came from Keshet, which is a Jewish organization that deals with a lot of these issues. We'll talk through a little bit more terminology on some other levels at the second session. The second session is also going to be the more focused on what our practices are and how this, what the implications are for what we do and where we need to be thinking about, some of the things that we've made decisions about and some of the things that we need to be thinking about. And in fact, talking with Dr. Bernstein earlier this week, discovered that there are things there are other issues that I hadn't even thought about that need to be thought about in relationship to this, and we'll cover some of that next week. All right, so where do we start? The very beginning, right? The creation of the first human being, right? Already, we have pronoun problems, right? So for those who say their pronouns are US and A, no, the pronoun issues go deep into our tradition. I call it problems because that's how people talk about it. But what we have here is the language of creation of a single being, right? And then in that single being, we're told, Zachar u'nekeva bara otam. Male and female, God created them. Right, so first it's ha'adam, right? The person, right? And then that person, we're told there's both male and female. The rabbis recognized the challenge in this language very early on. There is, right, the second creation story, right? So even before the rabbis, right, you have the biblical text, most likely that was trying to understand chapter 2, at least as I interpret it, is a creation story that's trying to understand chapter 1. Right, so what does it mean, male and female, God created them? Right, chapter 2 comes along with perhaps a male-centric view of it, right, of the one person, right, being male, and then taking the rib, right, from Adam to create the other person, the female, right, implying that just as the words male and female themselves, right, are defined from the male standpoint, right? The winners write the history. Is that what they say? And most of that history has been written by men, and so chapter 2, I think, reinterprets. It's possible it's also just a different tradition for the creation, but I'm going to say, as I see it, it's a reinterpretation of how do we understand that male and female coming from one being. But the Midrash sees it a different way from chapter 2, and I'm going to read through it, or unless somebody wants to come up to the mic to read, but I do want people to be able to hear online too. So, without any volunteers? Okay. So, commenting on the verse, Vayomer Elohim na'aseh adam b'tzelmenu kidmutenu, that let us make this singular being in our image according to our likeness. Rabbi Yirmiyahu ben Elazar said that when God created Adam Harishon, androgynous baru, right, mix of the Greek and Hebrew there, he created them as androgynous. Now, androgynous means a little bit different here than it does here. The rabbis tend to use androgynous in the way that we use intersex, as well as dealing with gender identity. We'll see sometimes it's either one. Here, I think he's talking about the understanding of intersex. That's the reason that it says male and female, God created them. Yeah. Having both sexes. That there were both parts. Now, they're going to interpret that in a different way than how it's usually experienced. They do address the intersex the truly intersex issue. But here, they're going to build on this idea that that this was an androgynous being, and Rabbi Shmuel ben Nachman says that when God began creating Adam HaRishon, the first person, he created that being with two faces, one on each side, and then split them along the middle, forming into two backs. Right? So this initial being was a male and female, at least according to Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman, right? Was a being that had, right, a male side and a female side, literally back to back, right? And we see there's a certain amount of creativity that's always involved in Midrash, but the issue that they're dealing with, right, is how could this single being not be one or the other, right? It's rejecting the binary notion, even as it's then going to move into that binary, right? Right. So they're going to solve the problem by seeing it as binary, but the initial issue that they recognize is that this is a non-binary, that the first creation was a non-binary being. Yeah. Yes. People. Yes. Right. Right. We're going to see some of what they did. But yes. So the other thing, though, is that when we see an artistic represent, as creative as our human minds can be, we're only, right. But generally, we're only creative enough to be able to put different parts of reality in that we've experienced together in different ways. We're not usually able to conceive of something that we have no experience with in the real world, right? And that's one of the reasons why talking about God, right, is so difficult when we talk about, well, what does God look like, right? God being this formless, well, we don't really know how to talk about a formless being, right? Especially when this formless being can create things that are in its likeness. Right. But, Maimonides said all of the language of Torah that's, giving God human-like qualities is all metaphor. It's just a way to be able to talk about God since we wouldn't have language to be able to use otherwise. All right, Felicia, I saw your hand up. Right. So it could be artistic representations that aren't necessarily about physical differences, but about gender differences that might be present within the same person. Yeah, Ross. Yeah, it would be conjoined. That is right. The rabbinic understanding, right, of at least one of the rabbinic understandings of what this was. Right, they challenge him. The other rabbis challenge him, right, because there's always people who are going to challenge when you put forth such ideas, and said, no, it says he took one of the ribs. And Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman says, no, the word salah can mean a side. It doesn't have to be interpreted as rib. And in fact, he gives examples from the Torah that uses the word salah as the side, referring to the side of the Mishkan. Right? It's clearly, right, not referring to a rib of the tabernacle. Right? It's talking about a full side, and that gives a very different understanding. Right? That if it is one being that was created with everything and then split equally, versus a being from which one part was taken to create something else. Yes. Right. So these conversations, right, we think of as new, and some of the forms of the conversations are, but the issues that they are addressing, right, are not new. Right? These are questions and understandings that people have been grappling with, over thousands of years and recognize. Now, when we talk about gender expression, the Torah seems to be less inclusive, shall we say. And that's on page 2, source 2. Right, we have, right, this you've probably heard quoted, right, that a woman should not wear men's apparel, and a man shall not wear women's apparel, because doing so is abhorrent to your God. It's a toeva. Well, we're going to see already. So Rashi, right, is already going to limit this understanding to say that ki doesn't always mean because, which we know, or for. It also can mean when. So a woman not putting on man's clothing or a man not putting on a woman's clothing when they are doing something abhorrent to God is forbidden, but not necessarily at other times, right? And the Shulchan Aruch makes clear, right, it is only when doing so, right, for some type of licentious purpose, in the language that they would have used, as opposed to, and that's why on Purim, it would be permitted. Right? Now, some people say, oh, well, Purim, you're allowed to do anything. But you're not. You are not allowed to eat pork on Purim just because it's Purim. Right? Right? You still are supposed to daven 3 times a day on Purim. Right? There is a greater freedom and freedom of expression, right? But it's not like you can break mitzvot. Right? So, and so this, what the Shulchan Aruch is commenting here, right, is essentially agreeing with Rashi that the prohibition is about wearing, expressing yourself in a different gender for purposes that will to go against whether it would be and the rabbis even in this source will talk about that it's about men who are trying to pass off as women in order to have access to sites where women are and to commit adultery, and things along those lines. So it's only if it is going to be leading to the breaking of some other commandment that the wearing of the other clothing is going to be prohibited. Now, obviously, there's also the normative halakha, throughout the centuries has been, to uphold the original Deuteronomy verse without any of that context, and that's why women traditionally didn't wear pants, and that is actually comes from a halakhic source, right? But that source is based on those rabbis' interpretation of this, and of 22.5, right? Not of Rashi on 22.5. Right? And that's why I gave them 2a and 2b, so we could see that these are both connected to that first. Yeah. So mostly they will say, I don't know that they address the question for war. Usually they're thinking about it in sexual terms. Yes. But again, remember, these are a bunch of men sitting with a bunch of men all the time. They're
That's a very important broad question.
right. Right, right. And, of course, we've all seen Yentl, right? Right, so to be able to have access, and Yentl is not a singular story in Jewish tradition. We find through the Talmud many other examples, not many, several other examples of women who are working to gain access or who did gain access to be able to study, and the surreptitious ways that they would do so. And even some men who would teach the women in their family, even though it wasn't the norm, they wanted the women in their family to be able to learn, right? So whether or not it is just about what roles, I'd need to look a little bit to see if there's anything that addresses that aspect of it. But mostly, as I said, they're thinking about sexual violations, and part of that is the word to'eva, right, which is mostly associated with the Torah's understanding of sexual violations. Okay, so we see that law, right, may not be as all-encompassing as it appears to be. Right. Now, thinking about gender and sexuality, the next text is really interesting from Brachot. And it's dealing with what constitutes a bracha levatela, a blessing that is said for no purpose. And the rabbis have very strong views against saying a blessing that is not connected to an action or to a specific situation. And so the Mishnah says that one who has a wife who is pregnant, and he says, may it be God's will that my wife will give birth to a male child. This is an example of a bracha levatela, or tfilat shav, empty prayer. What do you note just in that, before we get to the objection? What,
They must have figured out the gender is determined basically at inception.
that at least what they understood as gender, right? But the biological parts, right, is something that is at inception, right? Not something that comes along later in the process of a pregnancy, which is already a fairly advanced medical notion. I don't know how they had. Yeah, I guess. Or of sex. Yeah. Right. When do genitals develop? Yeah. 8 weeks is what, okay, so, yeah, right, so they,
Well, you actually, the cool thing, but the really cool thing about biology is that fetuses have growth up until the point where the Y chromosome exerts pressure. I wish I had this.
Already your brain is.
Yes. So the presence of the Y chromosome, as I remember it, causes the testosterone. Thank you. I took sexuality in neuroscience.
okay.
So you actually right, and then what you have is so the Mullerian ducts, which could form into either. I mean, it's so cool.
Right.
It's amazing because the parts that form into fallopian tubes turn into testes and the whole epididymis and all that cool stuff. And the parts that turn into the uterus, I guess, turn into prostate gland. It's like it's
All right. Just in case there are people who can't hear online, what we're talking about is biologically, fetuses begin with both, and at a certain point, the Y chromosome will exert itself, changing the receptors into a way that transforms, either into male parts or female parts, but using the same material, essentially. Is that a close enough summary?
And that actually corroborates what you see above. You made them both,
Right.
and then each one of them. That's fascinating.
Right. Okay. But, of course, as we know, there will be an objection. There always are. Rav Yosef here raises an objection and says, wait a second. We have a tradition that when it says that Dinah is born, it says, Va'achar yalda bat, that later she bore a daughter. What is this achar? What is this later? And Rav said that Leah passed judgment on herself, right? There's the whole rivalry going on between Leah and Rachel. In rabbinic tradition, interestingly, Leah is treated often very kindly, that of things that she would go out of her way to do for Rachel. The biblical text isn't quite that clear in it, but that tradition does exist. And so it says that Leah said she knows that there's going to be 12 tribes. She's received that nivuah, that prophecy. And she said, 6 came from me, right? 4 came from the maidservants, which is 10. If I now have another male child, then Rachel will only have one of the tribes, which would be less than either of the maidservants, right? And so she didn't want Rachel's esteem to be lower than the maidservants. She wasn't quite wanting her to be all the way at her level, right? But she cared somewhat to her, and so they prayed, and Dinah was transformed into a daughter. Right? And so he is saying, so Rav Yosef is saying, so there is a situation here where gender or sex may have changed because of a prayer. But the rabbis say, Ein maskirin maaseh nisim. We don't use these, miraculous, one of a kind type events, right, to decide what the rules are going to be, right? We have that same concept today, right? We'll talk about the exception that proves the rule, right? So Dinah, they're saying, is the exception, right? That there happened, but that it's not something that's available to anybody. Dinah in uterus was developing as a male. Leah, they didn't. It's midrash, right? It's the point of what it's trying to teach us, not the facts of what it is trying to teach us. Yeah, right. So Leah is pregnant with what they have received prophecy of some sort to know that it was going to be male, and Leah prayed so that Rachel would not only have one tribe from her, that she would have 2. So that she would be of equal esteem, right, of Zilpah, her maidservant who had 2. Right. They can't, right, they're saying you can't make that prayer after the pregnancy occurs, right? Before conception, you may pray for whatever it is you want to pray for, right? But once the deed is done, it is set out on a certain biological path, and the belief is that prayer is not going to change the biological facts, and the fact that there is one case, right, Leah made it happen, but that one case does not prove wrong the rule, right? It is the exception that proves the rule. I'm sure that is the basis, yeah. Right. It is a very lovely, generous reading for the Mishnah. Right. Right. No, I love that. Right, right. And it's certainly possible that whoever's comment this originally was, that made it into the Mishnah, was thinking along similar lines, and it was only the men afterwards who interpreted it in this way. But even there, right, it is there. While you're not allowed to pray for it, right, it creates the possibility of that a gender expression, right, is not necessarily only biology. Identity, thank you. Right. As I said, this is helpful because I always get them mixed up. Oh yeah, but they weren't supposed to after the conception. Yeah, of course they did. They're men.
It's kind of like if you're driving home and you see smoke in the direction you're going, you're not supposed to pray it's not your house because
Right.
it's already happened, so you can't declare it's meaningless because you can't change what already happened.
Right. That's a great example. Again, for those who are online might not have heard, Cliff reminded us of the example of if you see smoke in the direction that you're going, you're not allowed to pray that it's not your house. Right? Again, do people pray it's not their house? Of course they do. Right? But the rabbis are putting forth this principle, right, that prayer is not what is going to, prayer does not change those types of facts on the ground. Once something is set, it's not going to be God intervening to say, oh, it's your neighbor's house now, not yours. Right? The house that's burning is the house that's burning. And of course, we shouldn't wish evil upon our neighbor either. There's a reason it's a commandment to love your neighbor. If it were easy, you wouldn't need to command it. Okay, so now here's where it gets really interesting in terms of where rabbinic law actually does recognize the non-binary nature, both not only of intersex, but here they're understanding androgynous the way that or biological sex, right? But here it's understanding it in terms of gender expression, right? Because it says that it defines who is an androgynous, and it's yeshbo drachim shaved la'anashim v'yeshbo drachim shaved la'nashim. This being, right, has some aspects of how they are, right? That's how I'm translating their derech, right? Their way. Some of their ways are similar to how we think about men, and some of their ways are how we understand feminine. Right? So they have broken down the binary nature of gender expression and perhaps identity, both, I think, here. Right. Right. Because they're going to make a... So they would probably talk about not their derech, right? That their derech isn't usually how you would talk about biological parts. Right? Yeah.
I think there's an extension, we kind of made the case for non-binary nature, but there's also a case, and I don't know if this is taken too far, for fluidity, because it's not just the initial,
Right.
the example of the fetus is the change, but I think this even supports fluidity throughout.
Right, and especially in the second Mishnah from Rabbi Yosei, right, who says that the androgynous is a unique kind, meaning there is not just male and female. There is this other category, again. And then they distinguish that from the tumtum. Now, this usually is talking about sexual organs when it's talking about the tumtum. But what they're saying about the tumtum, where it may have some of both, is that still, pa'amaim shehu ish, pa'amaim shehu isha. Right? Sometimes this person presents and is a male, and sometimes it is a female. Right? So, and again, we know people who are, I at least know people who are genderqueer who will sometimes, on certain days they'll wake up and dress masculine type of clothing, and on some days they'll dress in what we think of as feminine type clothing. And this isn't just about clothing, right? This is saying in their inner being, right? They are sometimes a man and sometimes a woman. The tumtum itself refers to biological, but the way that they're talking about it here, I think, goes into gender. Right. 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 But it's also much more in our society, right, how we dress. There's a lot more freedom of how we dress, that it's not necessarily about identity. Whereas I think in this time period that this is being written, I think that expressions that didn't match identity were, goes back to the Deuteronomy text of not dressing, in the other way. So the rabbinic understanding, I think is likely taking both expression and identity as a singular. Right, but they may not have made that distinction. But what they certainly. Right. Right. But how they would have experienced that identity shift likely would have been through expression. Yeah. Right. Right.
Just to clarify, the other type of fluidity, though, that I was also thinking about is the sometimes maybe different periods of someone's life.
Mm-hmm.
Days of the week.
Correct.
And there it may correlate that so one-time identification or one-time identification.
Right.
Different periods of someone's life where in that way identity expression may correlate, but change added.
Yeah, definitely. So, first of all, I just want to, generally the term. Right. Hermaphrodite. So we are about to get into that exact in the next text. This next text. Yeah. Right. Right.
Hermaphrodite is not really a term that's used in human sexuality, gender identity, and biology.
Right. 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 No, I mean, part of this again is educating ourselves, and because the terminology does change. But the question itself that you're asking, the tumtum is one where it's specifically it is unclear. So yes, it had both male. It had both male and female parts. All right, but now to get to Janaki, we have to jump forward about 1,500 years to a Hasidic text. So he says that the initial intention for Yitzchak and how he was born was he had the soul of a female. Right, and then they say that he became male at the point of the Akedah. That he was 37 and hadn't produced kids at the time of the Akedah, and 3 years later he doesn't. So they identified maleness, and again, this is right. This is not medical. This is not right. They identified maleness with the ability to impregnate. Right. That he started out having the more studious and right. But with Jacob, he started out, and they say that that's why they sent him off to Laban, was so he could learn to toughen up, right? That perhaps there was some gender identification going on there, right? Which there's a lot in the text that would support that in terms of his dwelling in tents, Rachel loving Yaakov, right? Or Rivka loving Yaakov, right? Whereas Yitzchak loved Esau, right? And so there's a fair amount that would support a reading as well that Jacob went through some type of transformation related at least to gender expression.
So I'm curious as to whether Rabbi
Zlako, yes?
was Kabbalistic or not, because
Very much so, and he's going to quote Kabbalah here.
I didn't get that far, but that first idea is reminding me of the Yud Hey Vav Hey and that whole thing about how Yud Hey Vav Hey embodies the male and
Female,
female
yes.
God.
Right.
And maybe I think
Right. So the yud, right? A word beginning with a yud is usually, if you're talking about a verb, right, is for female, right? Words ending in hey in a noun, right, are usually associated with female, right? So yud hey vav hey sort of has all of that within it, right? And we talk about God having different gender expressions, right? That some of God's expressions are masculine and some of them are associated as feminine, and with the Shekinah, being how we refer to those female aspects of God. And that gets us back again to the beginning, right? That if we are created B'Tselem Elohim, right? So we are created in the image of this being that can have both male and female aspects, right? Then we also may have that, and in fact do. Not each of us, but as a collective. Some people would say each of us also. Right, things that we've defined as male and female, right. 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 All right, well, I want to just quickly get to the rest of the text because it talks about actually this whole issue of animals, right? That they notice that there's a lot more fertility problems among humans than other animals. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. An animal that was not fertile probably didn't live very long. If it was they're talking about domesticated animals here. They could be, but they mostly talk about domesticated. I think that the word here, behema. The word behema usually is referring to, no, there are wild beasts, but they wouldn't have normally differentiated that because that's not who they interacted with, right? Right. Okay. Right. So the question of the relationship to the animal world, right? They're also recognizing somehow, and again, it's not scientific. Their understanding of it in the way that we understand scientific, but they are understanding that people can express differently from their biology, and B, that expression and identity can change over the course of a person's lifetime, right? And it says, and then it goes into this mystical notion of Gilgul HaNefesh, the rolling of the soul, which we usually think of as when one person dies, the soul going into another. But what they suggest here is that can also mean at times a female would be in a male body because of the Gilgul HaNefesh, and sometimes it would then come to be in a male. A female would come to be in a male. Right? So this notion that it's not necessarily just about from one generation, but that our souls, that the inner being of who we are, right, may not be consistent with the body in which our soul resides. It is mostly a Kabbalistic tradition. I would say there is not a notion of reincarnation like you come back as a cat. At least I haven't come across it. But the idea that souls can re-inhabit is definitely part of Jewish thought. It's not a far fringe idea. Well, there's that too. If we want to talk about what happens after we die, that's a different class. But I will tell you that anything that you have heard from another religious or cultural tradition, you will find an important Jewish thinker who has said that that's what Judaism. Well, no, we just recognize that we don't need to all think the same thing about what happens after we die, since none of us know. Unless, of course, our souls have been reincarnated, in which case maybe they do know, but we don't have access to it. Yes? Did you want to? Oh. Okay. The final piece is a more recent, but its origin is more interesting also, right? Because we tend to think of the Sephardic and Eastern traditions as, let's say, less progressive on these issues, and that their cultures are less progressive on these issues. So seeing somebody, Ottoman, a Turkish rabbi dealing with, and they're dealing with in the situation of a get, right? That a man and woman were married, and the woman has changed into a man. Right? And do they still need to get a get? Right? And it says that this person is now a man in every respect, supporting his claim with an appeal to early modern scientific knowledge. Right? Rules that there is no need for a get, since the woman of the original contract no longer exists. This is a case. This is case law. In 1896 in Turkey. I only know what's on the text. Thank you. Right. So
So there's two possibilities, right? There's the possibility that she was actually a young man dressed as a woman, and then the husband finds out, or
that's not how it's presented. Right. So here's the question as it was presented to the rabbi. Right. Is a proper get necessary in the following circumstance? A certain man married a young Jewish woman and was with her in the manner of men and women. But after many years, an event occurred to her, and she was changed from female to male in every respect. Again, I don't know what was happening in terms of surgery or whatever at that time. I certainly haven't. I don't know if our doctors have. But this is... Right. Or late developing, who knows? Right? So they want to know, what is the law? For one had been a woman married to a man and then became a man, right? If he wishes to marry another woman, the he being the transgender, the he being the original man, does he need to give a proper get to this person? Or rather, do they not need to give a get at all because that person is no longer the person who they married? They've transformed. And says, do not be surprised by this question, since all things are possible and there's nothing new under the sun. And then it quotes where another sefer that was from the 18th century brought several examples like this. And now we get on the backside the rabbi's response. Regarding this case discussed by the author, right, he wrote that a holy one from among the sages of Jerusalem may be rebuilt and resettled. Was wondering whether this woman was obligated in circumcision or exempt, but it's obvious that she's exempt since Scripture says for every male's foreskin. Right, so that meaning that their biological essence was male. Which, of course, not necessarily the terminology, but be that as it may. Then it says, regarding our question, it seems that a get is not needed, since he is a man now and not a woman. For the format of the get is that a man gives it to his wife and writes, "You were my wife." But in this case, there is no wife to give it to, but a man. Right? And regarding this event, that an adult woman should be transformed into a man, how could it happen in a natural way that this inverted world could be grasped by human intellect? Do not be surprised by this, for it was already known in the book of Yad Na'eman, which wrote, "You should know that scholars of anatomy have not found any differences between the forms of the organs of males and those of females, except that hers are internal and his are external." Right? And again, this is early science. Yeah, and the internal member can be turned out, and from the female, they can be turned inward. Right? Right, and it seems logical in this case, right, that many visible signs that he is a man, as can be seen by everyone, he does not need a get, since he is not a woman, but a full man. But they're actually very specific. Right, but the Yad Na'eman, again, is this 18th century text that says, you should know that scholars of anatomy have not found any differences, right, and that male can turn into female, female can turn into male. Now, again, they are likely not separating gender identity and sexual identity here, but they are recognizing that this idea of transgendered or transsexual, right, is something that that exists, and whether or not commonplace, but exists enough to say, this isn't a one-time occurrence. Right. So I didn't bring this forth in terms of saying that this is how we should interpret Jewish law. My point in bringing it forth is to recognize that the questions and the issues that arise from the questions in terms of halakha, right, are not a 21st century phenomena. Right. And we saw, these texts that I brought you, really go from biblical to early rabbinic to Middle Ages, early Hasidic, and early modern period, right? And across all of those periods, Judaism is dealing with these questions of people who are non-binary. Last two questions, and then I will wrap it up. Right. So that's one of the. Right. So next session, the 17th, is going to be the practical application, at least, of some of this, and the additional questions that we're going to need to work out. I will just make mention of the if you don't mind, of the one that Jeff and I were talking about, which is, dealing with a question of how do we identify Jewishly, right? What makes somebody Jewish by a legal definition when they're born? Well, we say Jewish mother, right? But what if but we know from the laws of surrogacy and adoption that it is the birther, right, not the mother, which means that if you have somebody who is transgender, female to male, but does not have surgical change, then this man could be the birther, but it is not the baby's mother, it's the baby's father. So then, is the baby automatically Jewish? Right? Right? And this is not theoretical. Right? This is this is very much, these circumstances happen. Right? And we need to figure out. And my response was, if anything ends up changing the conservative movement's stand on Jewish identity in terms of parentage, I think it will be this, not the issues that were driving it in the Reform and Reconstructionist movement, because I think it will become impossible for us to be able to say, right, if we are recognizing people as they are, for us to say that a Jewish baby is always born of a Jewish mother, right? And again, I realize this has much broader implications, and that's not the topic, but it raises, again, the types of issues. Yeah. No. Right. Right. Nothing, can overcome tenure. We know that.
Well, it might have had something to do with the whole thing of she wasn't the same person they hired. But anyway.
Well, No, but yeshiva, they would have had a legal issue as well because they do get public funds for their non.
It's a
Yeah.
really, really, really good book. Highly recommend it. I'll put it on.
Yeah, please do. I'm going to send out. Actually, if you can send it to me, I'll include it with the materials that I'm going to send out to the congregation following this.
She does a lot of speaking now
Right.
about this kind of topic.
So I just want to wrap up. It is not my contention that the Jewish world was an open, welcoming place to people of all genders and sexualities, all throughout time. And I don't think the fact that there were rabbis dealing with this issue changes that. But what it does tell us, right, is that this is not only a 21st century issue, that these would have been seen as problems, because that's how it comes before the rabbi, right? People, they don't know what to do, right? And so the rabbis, and here where I'm not talking about the rabbis, I'm talking about rabbis who are in communities, are always interacting with the community that is in front of them, right? And they were experiencing people, again, was it broad spread, open, etc.? Probably not. But it certainly was there, was recognized in legal terms, right? All the Mishnah texts, right? It's all dealing with Jewish law, and continued to be addressed. And we are going to talk about sort of what is the next steps for us then in understanding what is our community in front of us, right? And how do we make sure that everybody who is here and everybody who may not be here should feel welcome and a part of our community, and what are some of the things that we may need to change. And I've had several people in the lead up to this say, well, we don't have anybody here. It is not true. Yeah, it is not true. It is not, again, is to the extent that people believe that, I think is the extent to which it may not be it may not have been a comfortable place for people to come forward in their full expression of themselves. Gedal v'yikedah. Amen. Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabba Mavorach Le'olam Alomei Amaya. Barichu. Amen. 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 Bruchim to you, Yishar Kochchem, for staying and for participating. And February 17th will be part 2.